Long before weather forecasts, before planting schedules came printed in books, and centuries before apps told you when to bring in the sheep, there were bones. Just bones cleaned, warmed by firelight, and read like maps by tired hands in cold barns in the far north. Viking farmers didn't just endure winter. They listened to it. They watched the sky, the snow, and the way a sheep's shoulder blade cracked near the hearth. Because in those quiet signs was spring. Tonight, we'll follow the forgotten rhythm of a world where knowledge lived in silence, and where survival depended on reading the earth through nothing more than instinct, ritual, and a single scorched bone. Chapter 1. Bones in the smokehouse. The first thing you notice is the smell. A faint mixture of damp earth, ash, and cured mutton. Somewhere behind you, the coals are still warm from last night. You are standing in the low doorway of a Viking-era smokehouse, its walls made of turf and timber, its air thick with generations of smoke. The door creaks behind you as you step inside, boots crunching softly on frostbitten straw. The morning sun hasn't reached this far inland yet, and your breath ghosts before your face. It is early spring in a Scandinavian farming settlement, sometime around the year 870. The sea ice is receding, but the fields remain frozen. This is the hinge of the year, a moment both still and uncertain. It is also the season of sheep bones, not for soup, not for tools, but for divining the shape of the season to come. Among the Norse farmers and herders of this age, survival depended less on the grand tales of seafaring and conquest and more on the quiet rituals of animal husbandry, harvest timing, and weather reading. And one of the oldest, most rural tools for this purpose was the shoulder blade oracle or scapulimancy. The idea was simple, if mysterious. Take the dried shoulder blade of a winter-slaughtered sheep, hold it to the light or fire, and read. The cracks, if the fissures ran deep and clear, it was said the frost would linger. If the lines curved like river deltas, it foretold thaw and bounty. If the bones splintered under pressure, it might mean illness, failed crops, or violent storms. Not everyone in the village practiced it. It was often the older men or women grandparents too bent for fieldwork, but still rich in memory, who kept the lore. Some whispered the bone should only be read by moonlight. Others insisted the bone must come from a sheep born in last spring's thaw and slaughtered on the shortest day of winter. The rules varied, but the purpose was steady, to read the year. In advance, one small crack at a time. You might imagine a group of 3 or 4 figures sitting quietly around a hearth in a sod-roofed barn. They turned the white, clean bone over in their hands, comparing it to last year's cracks. A few murmured words. A nod. A worried look. Nothing more. The sheep have already done their part. The bones now speak, the practical application of this. Odd custom lay in agricultural scheduling. The Norse calendar was more of a loose agricultural rhythm than a fixed chart. There were 2 seasons, winter and summer. Spring was a liminal state, a shifting phase between frost and fertility. Predicting the moment to begin plowing, planting, or sending ships back to sea could mean the difference between surplus and starvation. But without written almanacs or detailed records, these farmers leaned on observational lore. They studied birds. They watched ice melt. They listened to winds. And yes, some cracked sheep bones. This was not magic in the modern sense, nor was it religion. It was a mixture of pattern recognition, traditional knowledge, and desperate hope. In an era without precise meteorology, the land spoke in signs. Bones were just one of many tools in the Viking farmer's arsenal. Interestingly, scapulimancy was not unique to the Norse. Versions of the practice existed in ancient China, Mongolia, and parts of the Celtic world. In each place, people used animal bones, usually shoulder blades or flat pelvis pieces, as tools for divination. What unites them all is the context. Societies dependent on cycles of growth, weather, and survival. It made sense to look for Messages in the remains of animals that fed and clothed you. Among Viking communities, the bones were sometimes scorched slightly over flame, not to cook but to reveal new cracks. The heat would expose fault lines hidden in the surface, as if the fire could coax out truth. To the outsider, it might seem like superstition. But to the farmer standing in a half-lit barn, trying to decide whether to risk the last of the grain for planting, a cracked bone offered something rare, a decision point. Sometimes the predictions were shared only within the family. Other times, a village might gather on the barn and await the judgment. The news wasn't always good. A badly cracked bone could deflate an entire planting effort or delay it until signs improved. But equally, a clean reading might inspire an early start to the year, leading to longer harvests and better trade. One surviving folktale, retold in the 19th century but attributed to much earlier oral tradition, describes a farmer in Jutland who read a clean, forked crack in a sheep bone as a sign of double blessings. He planted his barley early and ended the season with enough surplus to trade for iron tools from a traveling smith. It was said he marked the bone and hung it over his doorway every spring thereafter. Of course, not every prediction came true. Droughts arrived despite promising signs. Floods followed hopeful forecasts, but the ritual itself endured. Perhaps that is the most telling detail. For the Viking farmer, it wasn't only about accuracy. It was about rhythm, memory, and intention. Every bone was a conversation with the past. Every crack was a note in the song of the land. But if bones could whisper the weather, what else could they say? Chapter 2. Between Fire and Frost Scapulimancy in a Changing World. The Christian monks who came north with their books and their bells did not much care for shoulder blades. They brought with them a different calendar, different rituals, and different ideas about how the world should be read. Time, they said, was marked by saints' days and sacred feasts, not by the brittle signs in sheep bones or the curl of moss on a stone. And yet the bones persisted, even as churches were built on the foundations of older sacred groves, and even as priests recorded the seasons in ink on vellum. The Viking farmer, or more often now, his descendants, still knelt in the straw, warming bone to hearth. Not out of rebellion, but out of habit, out of need. For the land did not change when the gods changed. Spring remained uncertain, frost just as cruel. There are references, sparse but telling, in 13th century Icelandic texts that speak of asking the bones. In one court record from 1271, a man is fined for practicing pagan divination with the fleshless remains of livestock. The tone of the scribe is weary, not furious, as if this practice was too common to root out entirely, but improper enough to be frowned upon. Some historians believe scapulimancy in the Norse world faded, slowly absorbed into the rhythms of daily life without open conflict. Like so many folk practices, it shifted form rather than vanished. Where once a bone might have been cracked deliberately, it might now be studied as it came from the cooking pot, interpreted quietly without naming the act in rural parts of Sweden and Norway. Bone crack readings were still whispered about as late as the 17th century. And in the far north among the Sami people, variations of shoulder blade reading endured into modern ethnographic memory. Some Sami reindeer herders used shoulder bones to predict herd movement and snow patterns. While their beliefs were distinct from Norse customs, the principle was the same. Nature marked itself. If you knew how to see, the key to these readings was not certainty. It was narrative. In one village saga from the Gudbrandsdal Valley, a farmer is said to have warned his neighbors not to plant barley early one spring, having seen the sky's crack mirrored in the sheep's blade. He was mocked until late frost killed most of the early crops. The story survives not because it proves scapulimancy worked, but because it gave people a frame, an explanation for something unpredictable. This is how much of medieval peasant life operated. You, the listener, might imagine that the middle Ages were ruled entirely by superstition or religious dogma, but the truth is more delicate. People lived by systems that helped them organize chaos. The bones, like weather lore or almanac sayings, created meaning, and that meaning traveled when Norse settlers moved to places like the Orkneys, the Faroes, and parts of Ireland. They brought their customs with them. While there's no direct record of scapulimancy becoming widespread in those places, archaeological finds suggest a continuity of animal bone usage in ritual and practical settings. A cracked shoulder blade found in a turf house in Shetland. Bears' scorch marks inconsistent with cooking. Another, in a midden heap near a longhouse in Iceland, was cleaned and polished but uncut. To the modern archaeologist, these are mysteries. But to the farmer who lived then, they were familiar tools. It wasn't just weather that could be read. Over time, bone readers began interpreting fortunes beyond the frost line. A particular curl in the bone might speak to a poor lambing season. A jagged line near the edge might hint at a bad tooth in the head of the household. Yes, even illness was sought in those pale signs, but always with caution. The bones were not loud prophets, they were quiet messengers. Their meanings were layered, often contradictory, and rarely trusted in isolation. Sometimes, stories tell of farmers who saw nothing in the bone. No crack, no change in tone. These were considered ill omens or worse signs of fate not yet decided. In such cases, people might wait a week and try another bone. Or they might double their caution, delaying planting, reinforcing animal pens, or preparing an extra offering for the spirits or saints. You see, the beauty of the bone was not in its authority, but in its ambiguity. This ambiguity allowed it to survive where other forms of divination were crushed or condemned. A rune could be pagan, a spell heretical, but a bone held to fire? That could be anything. A cook's curiosity, a farmer's game, or, more truthfully, a conversation with a quiet and shifting world. This method of predicting spring endured not because it always worked, but because it gave the act of waiting meaning. The long stretch between winter and planting was a hard and hungry season. Food stores ran low. Illness crept easily through cold rooms. Any ritual helped. It gave the people of those frost-covered villages something to do, something to believe, and something to pass down. And even now, scattered through Scandinavian museum drawers and archaeological reports, there remain the bones, cleaned, scorched, and cracked in curious ways. Each one the echo of a hand that held it, of a hearth that heated it, and of a question asked softly into the thawing dark. But if such fragile traditions survived the shifting tides of religion and empire, what finally caused them to disappear? Chapter 3. The Last Thaw. When the bones fell silent by the mid-1800s, the old bones lay still. Across rural Scandinavia, small barns grew quieter in late winter. The lamps still flickered over haylofts, and sheep still huddled close to one another against the cold. But the practiced ritual of bone reading, the slow, fire-lit scrutiny of shoulder blades, had largely vanished from the memory of the living. If you had walked into a village longhouse around 1850 and asked whether anyone had burned the bone to predict the thaw, you'd likely receive puzzled looks, or perhaps a vague story from someone's grandmother. It didn't vanish all at once. Traditions rarely do. The art of scapulimancy, already practiced quietly and without official recognition, simply faded behind newer rhythms. The coming of standardized time, written almanacs, and meteorological tools gradually replaced the need for these local, fragile systems of knowing. What began the change was not hostility, but measurement. The 18th and 19th centuries brought with them barometers, thermometers, and printed weather tables. Even before railways stitched together vast territories, governments and scientific societies were exchanging seasonal data. Ships logged wind shifts, schools taught calendars. Local priests copied farming schedules from books sent from Stockholm or Copenhagen. Weather, once whispered in barns, was now printed and posted. For farmers, this was both a gift and a loss. The predictions became more accurate, but also more distant. The signs now offered by scholars in cities were no longer drawn from one's own land, livestock, or fire. The reading of bones was not refuted by science. It was simply made unnecessary by it. Still, remnants of the tradition survived well into the 19th century in remote places. Ethnographies collecting stories in northern Norway in the 1870s recorded tales of old ways to forecast spring, among them bone burning. In one village along the fjords, an elderly woman told of her father warming sheep bones near a pine hearth and declaring the spring would be harsh because the cracks curled like a snake's path. She could not recall when they'd last done it themselves, only that it had once been so. By the turn of the 20th century, even these echoes began to dissolve. The world was speeding up. Steamships brought goods to isolated harbors year-round. Telegraph wires buzzed with distant decisions. Crops were no longer planted solely on ancestral rhythms, but on agricultural directives published in newspapers, and yet, something about the bones lingered, not as tools, but as stories in Scandinavian folk memory. References to shoulder blade readings can still be found, though usually wrapped in superstition or turned into anecdotes. In children's rhymes or whispered tales, the bone readers are sometimes cast as odd or mystical, part wise, part strange. But even in these caricatures, there's a thread of quiet respect. They are remembered not for magic, but for care, for their attentiveness to nature, for the simple act of noticing what others overlooked. Archaeologists today occasionally find scapulae cleaned, charred, or cracked in ancient refuse pits or beneath hearthstones. Most are not cataloged as ritual items. Some are dismissed as cooking remains, but a few carry just enough anomaly, a scorch without cooking, a fracture that runs strangely that someone takes notice. One such shoulder blade, found beneath a 10th century farmhouse in Sörgland, Sweden, bears fine spidering cracks along one edge. The team that discovered it published a modest note: possible evidence of pre-Christian scapulimancy. No more than a line. But enough to remember. The bones remind us of how deeply intertwined observation and belief once were. They show us a time when knowledge came not from books or broadcasts, but from touch, from flame, and from the patient, repetitive rhythm of seasons endured. A time when survival was shaped not just by what the eye saw, but by how the hand interpreted it. You might wonder, what do we lose when we stop listening to small signs? Modern weather predictions are astonishingly precise. We know when storms will land, when rivers will rise, and when frost is likely. But in gaining precision, perhaps we've also lost something softer: the rituals that reminded us of our place inside a cycle greater than ourselves. The silence of the barn, the flicker of firelight, the way a cracked bone could feel like a voice, speaking softly of thought. It's not about going back. The bones, like many old tools, have served their purpose, but they are worth remembering because at the heart of their use was not superstition, but care. A care for the land, for animals, for one's family, for the unseen patterns that shape every growing season. So the next time winter begins to loosen its grip, and you find yourself wondering when the warmth will return, imagine for a moment someone kneeling quietly in straw, holding a bone to firelight and listening, not for certainty, but for meaning, and perhaps, in your own quiet way, you'll hear it too. Thank you for spending this quiet moment in history with me. If you found comfort in the slower rhythms of the past, or simply enjoyed the soft shuffle of sheep bones and forgotten Viking barns, I'd love to have you here again. This is quite boring sleep, and that's just how we like it. If you'd like more calm stories like this, about the overlooked corners of history, the small things that mattered, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps others find their way here too. Maybe even drift off a little easier. Until next time, sleep well, stay curious, and don't forget to listen to the bones.